we're going to begin the final panel discussion of the conference. My name is Kate Wolford. I serve as president of the McKnight Foundation, which is a fourth-generation family foundation based here in the great state of Minnesota. And it is too late to welcome all of you, obviously, because most of you are heading for the airport after this. But I just want to say thank you to CEP and thank you to all of you for being here in Minnesota on behalf of all of us who work in philanthropy here in the state. And there are quite a few of us here, so I just want to give a shout out to all my colleagues from Minnesota. Where are you? We've really been honored by having you here, and the conversations that are taking place here will definitely continue, not only in terms of discussions and fueling our really in-depth reflection on what effective philanthropy looks like, but also translating that into daily actions. So again, thank you for being here. This last panel is called What Effective Philanthropy Looks Like Right Now. So I have a paraphrase after thinking about all of this conference, and it's a little bit of a tongue twister. We're going to be talking about the principles and the practices that deliver on the promise of philanthropy and minimize its perils as it plunges into the paradox of power, privilege, politics, and proximity in an age of populism, polarization, and pointed critiques. That's pretty good. This will test who can tweet the fastest, whoever got that. So I think I've been at every CEP conference since the beginning. And I would say this one is quite different. When I think about a lot of the conversations in the past, as always, including here, a lot of it has been about really kind of practices, everyday practices about how we do our grant making, relate to nonprofits, how do we scale effective programs, how do we scale effective organizations. But this one, we have really dug into some pretty deep meta issues. When you think about not only what does it mean to do giving done right, but I think it's causing us to ask the question, are we doing the right work? When we think about these challenges of really in-depth challenges to our democratic norms and institutions, structural racism, deep inequality, erosion of civil society, and we haven't really even touched on threats to our planetary systems. So we've really been at a meta level, and yet this morning, I think, thanks to Takara and Luis, it also got real. What this means in the lives of everyday people. So over this next hour, we've asked some of your colleagues to really share kind of their reflections coming out of the conference, but translating that into what are effective practices that they are doing to transform philanthropy to be as effective as it possibly can be. What are the promising and emerging practices? So we want to really leave you with ideas that we see in the field and want to see more of to be able to deliver on that promise and minimize the perils. So let me introduce this fabulous panel. Their bios are on your app and in your written materials, so let me just briefly say who's up here. So he who needs no introduction, Phil Buchanan, the first current, which means the only president, of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, having started in 2001. And you'd have to have your head under a rock if you don't know that he is the author of a hot-off-the-press book called Giving Done Right, and we're going to talk about that momentarily. Next to Phil, Jacqueline Martinez Garcel, who is the CEO of the Latino Community Foundation, the only statewide foundation that is focused solely on investing in Latinos in California. They worked with Google.org to launch the first ever Latino nonprofit accelerator to scale the impact of frontline social change organizations. Larry Kramer, who is the president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the world. It is a national and global funder, and it's probably one of the few foundations I know that actually has an effective philanthropy program. Larry is also a law professor, and once you are, you never stop being it, and I always trust Larry to help us go beyond the soundbite and really dig in to really probe our thinking, and I trust he will do that today. Next on the panel, Janine Lee, who is the CEO and president of the Southeastern Council of Foundations, which has over 330 foundations and corporate giving programs as its members across 11 Southeastern states, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands. She is also the co-author of Funding Effectiveness, Lessons in Building Nonprofit Capacity. And next to me is Tony Richardson, who has been at the Nord Family Foundation for about 4 years, but 2 months ago, he was named Executive Director of Nord Family Foundation, which serves Northern Ohio. He was also the youngest African American ever elected as an at-large member of the Lorain, Ohio City Council. So, fabulous group. Glad to have you here, and I'm going to start with Phil about this wonderful book called Giving Done Right. We still have a chance to get it signed. So last week you tweeted, of all the crazy off-target dissing of nonprofits and their staff, the blanket assertion that nonprofits are inefficient drives me the most crazy. So that's really the introduction into your book. So could you just talk about kind of why you get so exercised over that? What's the core argument you make there, and kind of draw a through line from what we've heard about market society, market world, and why is that important as the starting point for your book?
Yeah. I mean, I wanted in the book to draw on the inspiration I feel about giving that has supported nonprofits whose work that have touched our lives in all kinds of ways that I think we often don't sufficiently appreciate, but also deal with the frustration that I have felt over 18 years that folks believe that nonprofits should operate like business, which is a meaningless phrase. What are you talking about, the dry cleaner or Google? And that giving is like investing. And to try to tell the stories in the course of trying to speak to givers about what it's really like, to lead nonprofit organizations. And at CEP, we've surveyed, I think the number now is a gazillion nonprofits in our research as well as our assessment and advisory services. But certain practices don't change in the way that I wish they would. Certain attitudes don't seem to shift in the way that I wish they would. And I believe that having read so many open-ended comments from nonprofits and then spending time shadowing nonprofit leaders, that many of them across our country and the globe are unsung heroes whose work is far more difficult than running an equivalent size business, and who do so much with so little. And yet, someone's company IPOs and they say, I'm going to take an investor mentality and really hold these unaccountable, underperforming nonprofits, feet to the fire. And that is no way to be effective. And so I don't know that these attitudes will change, but there was some deep frustration on my part, which you probably could feel in that tweet, about just having to read again and again, and recently in that ridiculous New York Times article about Charity Water that some of you may have seen, these stereotypes and caricatures that get in the way of effective philanthropy.
So let's keep going on that, because Center for Effective Philanthropy, if we think of anything, I think right away the words strategy and assessment come to mind. And so you've got a big body of evidence that has informed what went into the book. Could you talk a little bit about how your own thinking has evolved? Like, if you had written this book 10 years ago and writing it now, are there differences in how you think about it?
I would first of all start by saying that I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I've always thought that market world, which I think Anand does a great job of taking down, although I also have my differences with some of the ways he paints philanthropy, is the wrong model, right? That strategy is different in giving because you've got collaborative dynamics, not competitive dynamics. That performance assessment is different because there's no common unit of measurement, there's no analog to ROI. But I think I have learned a lot about just how different and just how difficult. I don't think, for example, 10 years ago when we did our research on strategy, which I still draw on, and I think it was really, really good, I don't know that we sufficiently appreciated just how iterative strategy has to be. And when I talk about strategy, I'm talking about like the logical hypotheses that guide your thinking about if we allocate resources this way, it will lead to that. I am not talking about the strategic philanthropy sort of baked up in a conference room at a big foundation with khaki-clad consultants and nice PowerPoints, then foisted on to grantees. I'm talking about shared strategy that isn't a single institution strategy. It's shared across funders and among grantees and iterative. And I think as we tried to promote the idea both that strategy was crucial and a part of most philanthropic successes, and that it was different than it is in the world of business, I still think I underestimated the complexity of just how hard it is to do well.
So when I think about all the things in your book and all the acclaim that I have read about it, is really saying, we say giving done right, but it really isn't like there is one right way.
Right.
It's much more about having the right questions to ask and sort of having guideposts that allow you to navigate through depending on what you're trying to achieve.
Right.
Some of that still feels very aspirational. Like, I don't know what the evidence says about how many of us are actually practicing with fidelity, sort of that pathway you described. But my question is, in light of everything we've heard here, it feels like we can no longer even speak of it as aspirational. It's almost like it's this social license to operate. Like, these are sort of the fundamentals we have to get right, and now we're hearing like we've got a whole new level of complexity and systemic issues we have to navigate. So I guess I'm wondering if the book's already a little dated and you would be writing an epilogue, or maybe just a blog coming out of this. Are there other things that you would want to say that you might not have captured in the book?
Yeah, I think that, of course, I think it's not dated, and I think, I believe that obviously critique of philanthropy is healthy and questioning, the system as it is, and I also think that there has been sometimes a kind of an unfortunate conflation of like frustration with our approach to taxation, which I share, with almost a dissing of the whole notion of philanthropy, which I worry about, and that some of the critiques, and the critiques are healthy, but saying they're healthy doesn't mean that we all have to agree with every element of them, right? We can also discuss and debate them, and I think one of the things that I worry about is that actually missing in many of these critiques is the story of the nonprofit sector, which is supported in a significant way by philanthropy. And so we need to hold up the examples of community-based nonprofits that are working with the most vulnerable people, of arts and culture organizations that make our communities stronger, of initiatives around the country that have worked, and what do we learn from the fact that we don't have to worry about whether people in our families can marry who they love anymore, and what are the lessons there for philanthropy? And so I feel like we have to be able to do both things at once, like talk about the systems and work to change them, and recognize that every day, like most of the people in this room, are working at institutions that have a lot of resources, and they're there now. The tax was what it was, and the money was made how it was made, and I'm not saying we should accept these things. I'm saying that we also then have the practical day-to-day challenge of, okay, what are we going to do? And so my book is really intended to be more about that. Like, how do you then do that work well within a system that, and this is the other thing, and then I'll stop talking because these are like my 5, faves, present company excluded. But but we have gone from, I think we have to be careful about, we've had 20 years of business knows best, market analogs are what we need for everything, and actually we in philanthropy have taken too much of that on, right? There's too much, they haven't pushed back well enough. And now there are some who are arguing, well, actually, philanthropy, and Anand was great today. I think he was a little bit more measured than he sometimes is on social media, where he has said things like, you really cannot separate philanthropy from self-protection and sort of reputation laundering. And I think when we take it to that level, that's not healthy either, because it suggests that all we need is government. And my own view is what we need is 3 sectors, each doing what they can uniquely do. Boundaries clear, not blurred. Boundaries are good. Maximizing their potential. A healthy government, we got a long way to go at both local and obviously federal levels. Healthy and guardrailed business sector, as we've been talking about, and then also a vital civil society, nonprofits supported by giving. They do different things. They need each other to do those things well in order for our society to be at its best. And we don't sufficiently appreciate the nonprofit sector in all its flaws, but in all its strength and diversity.
Great, thank you. I'm going to bring in some other voices. Janine, you also have kind of a bird's eye view, working and supporting over 300 giving programs and foundations. So when you're thinking about like the best practices and principles that you're seeing in action each day, and we want to see more of, can you share a few of those?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to say thank you, Phil, for writing the book. I want to say how intrigued and inspired I was in reading it. I wanted more. I appreciated the storytelling and wrestling with the complexity of it all. But one of the things I really appreciated was what you just said about where we were 20 years ago. It just so happens I was around 20 years ago. And I remember some of those early articles titled things like How Foundations Can Be More Like Venture Capitalists. I remember reading Built to Last and trying to extract the very best I could that related to philanthropy in the sector, and appreciated when Jim Collins then created the next iteration that really addressed our sector. And I remember when Bruce Sievers wrote a response that basically was titled something like When Pigs Fly, you know? And so, so I just want to say thank you for that. I think we all realize that we have reached an inflection point in our history, and I think we need a sense of urgency. I've said before on panels like this that I feel like in our sector, and I don't separate it, I feel like philanthropy and nonprofits, the public charities, there's an inextricable link between us. And I think we in philanthropy are the quiet giants. We are not using our collective voice, and it's past time. We've got to do that. I've taken a lot of notes on this, so I want to try to be pointed, but I want to deliver some of what I've thought about around this. I think that impact is a challenge, but I believe that philanthropy and nonprofits are really built around what constitutes a good life. I mean, if we're just telling the truth, you know, there's a moral dimension to this work, and I think what we struggle with as individual leaders is our own inadequacies. We don't like to talk about our field, our sector, in terms of the moral dimension of it, but the reality is we're really talking about love of humankind here, folks. And I think it's just baked in. I think, you know, in the book, Phil, you talked about goals and that being the what. You talked about strategy as the how. But I think there's another dimension of the how. And I think it's really essentially the soul, the essence, the heart, the way of being. And we've talked a lot here over the last couple of days about things like humility. Where does that fall? Where does that live? Money does not confer wisdom. I think we all know that. I loved what Stephen Hines quoted in the book as well around ambitions. So I work in the American South, and with the history of slavery that we all know about, discrimination, Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, there are so many similarities between the states, the 11 states that I work in. And so we had to kind of create a baseline of understanding. And once we understood it, we can't unknow it. Now that we know, we can't unknow it. There's a state of the South, and we haven't made quite as much progress in the South as we would like to believe that we have collectively. Individually, there's a lot of foundations celebrating. Collectively, what's happening in the South doesn't look that much different than it did a decade ago. We know that now. So I'm proud of my members, though, because our members in the South are really struggling with these issues, and our board has been very open to having conversations about equity, and we're going to be delivering an equity agenda to our members at our November annual meeting. So stay tuned for that. So a couple of thoughts that I have. The way we approach our work is, in essence, the way we hope things ought to be, all of us, collectively. We need to ask ourselves, why does what we do collectively matter? And is this the sector, philanthropy and nonprofits, is this the change maker sector? I think we are essentially representing the force for good. I think we help America find its better angels. There's so many examples of that in the book. And with the understanding, coming back to what Anand and Jeff talked about this morning, that there are systemic barriers that need to be dismantled, and all things that perpetuate those systemic barriers. What principles and values do we claim as our identity? I think is something that, going forward, as we think about the next 50 years, we have to ask ourselves. And Phil, you have a number of them in the book. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. Stephen Hines talked about being audacious in ambition and humble in approach. What about the virtues of fairness and equity? What about our desire for passion, our desire and passion for justice? What about acknowledging failures and appreciating what we've learned, our perspective and understanding? That's directly from the book. What about capturing stories of giving? Those stories are transformative. Every example you provided were transformational stories. I have a friend, many of you know, David Dodson, who runs MDC, that did some of the research on State of the South with SECF, and he talks about we need to read reality truthfully and take action responsibly. The only way you can do that is to get closer to the ground. We've heard many speakers talk about that during our time here. We've got to pay attention to the issues that matter most to the most vulnerable in our society. We've got to listen, we've got to build trust, and we've got to continue to struggle with this complexity.
Great. Thank you, Janine. Those are an amazing list of principles to really ground the work. And I'm going to turn right to Tony, who I think I saw shaking his head, and I know can pick up on that theme in terms of who informs the work.
Yeah.
And how are you thinking about that as you come into your position?
Well, one of the things I wanted to do as I first came into philanthropy and now into this position is not forget sort of my own lived experience and how that has shaped my worldview and my approach to work and life in general. So grew up single mom, never met my father. When she was about 3 months pregnant, he left her. And so the only man that I did call dad was murdered in 1993. I still remember the headline on the local newspaper, "Drug Deal Goes Sour." And so I'm 10 years old, summer 93, July 9th. And after that time, my mom disappeared, right? So no one knew what happened to her. They didn't know if she had disappeared or she was murdered or she was kidnapped. And so here I am, 10 years old, in this home that we were renting. We had just been evicted from the projects, so we moved across town to a place that was it was a slumlord. No running water, heat didn't really work, and so I essentially squatted for most of that summer because I knew how to get into the apartment and sort of hung out there, and then would go to different soup kitchens and go to different people's houses to eat, to sleep, and then eventually one of my friends, Derek, his mom had asked me, so I would say, "Can I spend the night tonight?" And she's like, "Well, yeah, you can spend the night, but you have to go down and ask your mom, is it okay if you stay tonight?" And I just broke down and started crying. And so she's like, "You can come live with us for a little bit until you figure out what your next move is going to be, right? Until you figure it out, 10 years old." And so I went to stay with them, 4 boys there. She really didn't have much. Biracial family, white woman. Their fathers were African American. And in fact, the middle child, Matthew, was murdered sometime after that. And so there was all this trauma around murder and sort of gangs. This was the 90s, right? This is at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic and just a lot of violence in our neighborhoods. And a couple years down the road, there's a huge sweep in our neighborhood of drugs, guns, and I ended up going to jail. I'm 14 years old at this time. And so the police, they apprehend me. They're saying that I fit the description. And when I had took off running, actually, one of the cops pointed a double-barrel shotgun in my face on Broadway. I'll never forget this. So I'm sitting in jail, and again, I'm an unaccompanied youth, so I don't have nobody to come and get me. Again, Renee, they would somehow let her come and get me. And I was like, I want to go to school because I realized if I stay out here, I'm either going to die out here or I'm going to go to jail. So I decided to go to school, and I approached Wagner, Arizidi, Wolf, and Miss Watson, and I asked them sort of hey, I want to come back to school, but if I come back, I need to be in the honors program, because I knew the kids who were in the honors program were getting fine arts. They were going on field trips. They had foreign language. I'm in the streets, but I understand sort of who's going to the boom side and who's going to the academy honors track. And so there's nothing in your background that says you're an honors student. And so I ended up getting in the honors program, made the honor roll every grade and period through law school. And so I hold that experience near and dear to my heart, but also understand that there are multiple experiences, and that I don't own the young, urban Black experience, right? I'm not the owner of that. I'm just one of many stories. And so as I come into philanthropy, how do I inform and work with my board around honoring and valuing lived experience expertise? How do we be more thoughtful about, learning, daring to learn, unlearn, and relearn as we go along our journey of grant making and trying to make stronger communities? And there's this notion of sort of screaming at the machine, right? We scream at the machine. We talk about all these injustices and institutional and structural racism and sexism, but then we're silent in our sector. We're silent in our offices. We're silent in our boardrooms, right? So how do we get out of sort of our silence and stop screaming at the machine and then mirror and model exactly what it is we want to do in our communities? And one of the things that several of the things, so very early on, Phil had reached out and asked would I sort of, be one of the readers and reviewers and sort of give some feedback on the book as you were going through the drafting journey. And one of the things that resonated with me the most was this idea of really appreciating and taking time to understand the totality and ecosystem in which your grant making is functioning, right? And then be aware of not just what you're doing as a foundation, but what other philanthropies are doing in government, right? And then the private sector, and then being sort of really, really articulate and really clear about what your goals are. One of the, for me, highlights that I always seem to laugh about or chuckle when I think about this is this idea of funders can sometimes be intoxicated by dollar signs, right? And Phil mentioned someone talking about that they're going to disrupt poverty, right? As if it was as simple as Uber disrupting the taxi industry. So I want us to be mindful of appreciating and taking time to learn what we're up against, and then daring to inspire, right? How do we work across different political ideologies real tensions around race and sort of inclusion, and really inspire and dare to learn from others and share, right, when we're in these spaces, and being authentic in our true selves and showing up and speaking from our experience, not from what we've heard or what someone has told us, right? And just standing up for what's right or what you believe is right. And then how do we institutionalize that within our workplace? I think that's so important.
Great. I'm going to thank you so much. I want to keep asking you questions, but I want to get everybody's voice in, so I'm going to ask Jacqueline to pick up on this thread, which really gets around power, and your focus is on social movements. So really talk about what does effectiveness mean, and how does that look differently, and what are some of the leading practices that you're bringing to bear to fuel that movement?
Thanks, Kate. I want to first start by thanking Phil and his team, Stephanie and Kevin and Grace, for putting this conference together, for never shying away from the hard topics, for putting the mirror in front of us and letting us stand there long enough to reflect. So thank you for that. I also want to thank you because I remember when I came into philanthropy a little over 13, 14 years ago, I came to CEP, my first meeting, I think it was, 2009. And I was moved by the fact that all of your panels reflected the diversity and demographics of our country. And here we are. I mean, the CEOs of, the largest foundations, both here in this country and across the world. But your team and you are always mindful to make sure that the perspectives on this here on this stage reflect this country. And I want to thank you for that. And I think we all can take something away from that. And that comes, somebody asked a question at the end of the last panel about power, right? How do we make sure that we invite Black women to take a podium over dinner and tell her experiences to a room full of, different people from different backgrounds? That's part of it, is who are we giving the podium to share their lived experience. Tony, to hear your story is to hear the stories of the CEOs of the nonprofits that we in California support, right? So when we put together our events, we want to put them on the stage, right? We want them to share their lived experience. I grew up in Washington Heights in the height of the crack epidemic, right? So everything that you said and the running for just safety, but then saying, I need to go and get what I see others are getting, come back and do something with it, right, is what drives me every single day. So when it comes to power, number one is who are we giving the podium to? And by podium, it's symbolic of something, right? Who are we allowing to tell the story? I love that you start your book with Tiffany's story, because she was a woman who grew up in a neighborhood and saw the effects of segregation, lived it out, but then went to school, came back, started an organization, and dedicated her life to making sure that people had access to opportunity. And yeah, she was a CFO, a CEO, a grants manager, a grants writer, but she brought all of it because of her lived experience to the table, right? And so we need to do more of lifting that out. So I also, taking away from the conversation today in this conference and when it's happening at a moment in time where, we can all agree that the ground underneath us is shifting. Not only are we going through a seismic demographic shift in our country, right? Like, our country is Black and brown, it is changing. And then we have this nationalism that's growing, and even California, hate crimes growing by 40%. So the question for all of us, I know that's where we're still here and hanging out, because we want to figure out what do we do with this, is what will philanthropy do at this moment in time? And we've gone, Ellen is here, her conference, 3 years, was about the same question. We can't keep doing incremental change anymore. That's one of the major takeaways. We got to really shift how we think about philanthropy, right? So the Latino Community Foundation is trying to build a movement of everyday people to be part of these giving circles, because we know that it doesn't just take a Bill Gates to lead a foundation, right? We need people to understand that they have the power and the agency to create change. That the EDs of the nonprofits are not just working things out in their community, but that they have the vision and the wherewithal to actually do it. So let's put them in a room together. Let's get the folks who work at Google and Pandora, because Anand said it, right? Like, the people who work in these institutions, the people who work in the foundations that we are trying to change, agree with 90% of what's been talked about throughout these last couple of days. but are we really collectively bringing our voices together and then bringing the people that are not in this room, because it's a real privilege to be in this room, to spend 3 days listening and debating on these issues. It's a real privilege. So what are we doing to expand that table and make sure that the solutions come from the people closest to the problem, that we create a table big enough to bring the Tiffany's of the world to that table, and to not be afraid to share the power, to share that power. So this Giving Circle movement has now turned into the largest network of Latino philanthropists. These are folks that, some of them are EDs in their organizations. Some of them have just come into the tech sector, and they're first generation, graduated from college, working at Google, and they're like, how do I pay it forward? How do I get someone like me to be in this place, not just 5 years from now, 2 years from now, right? And so we've collectively said there's a place for you, and we can make this work, right? And so our grant making is modest compared to maybe the size of your foundations, but we're proud about how we're building that movement, right? That philanthropy, that Latinos who've been called all kinds of names have now earned, right? Like, they are leaders, they are philanthropists, they are change makers. They are the ones who've lived this experience. I just had a whole conversation with the person cleaning the room in the other room. Like, my mom came to this country, she was cleaning beds at Days Inn to make it to another job at 3 o'clock in the afternoon so she can make it home to cook dinner so my father can start his night shift at the hotel he worked at, right? Like, that's why we're doing it. Phil always reminds us in all the books that it's about the people. And we sometimes come together and we complain a lot about our jobs, how overwhelming. One of the things I disagree with Phil is that it's overwhelming. No, it's not. You know what's overwhelming is having 3 jobs and taking care of your kids and surviving in a neighborhood, right? Trying to make sure that your kids are getting home safe from school. That's overwhelming, but those people are not complaining, they're just doing it. So we gotta just get up and stop complaining and just act, but act bigger, think bolder. Just turn this whole system on its head. And we have to own the fact that philanthropy is a byproduct of the issues that we are trying to fight and change. And let's not be afraid of that conversation. Let's have it. But then let's have it by saying, how can we actually be bolder in our giving, with our endowments? How can we stop blaming the donors for they the ones who want to write the check? No. Put them in a room. Push them. As CEOs of community foundations, you can push them to think about the things that they are funding. And I'm all for funding arts and culture and schools, but let's be real. Without the people in our neighborhoods, what's the good in it? I am happy that in less than 24 hours, $300 million was put on the table for Notre Dame. But my goodness, our schools are on fire. And what are we doing to put it out? Why are we not putting together $300 million to invest in our school systems so that we can push government to do more? Because we're not here to replace government. We all know that. But let's be bolder in our solutions so we can get more out of the government that we've elected. Wow. I lost my notes because then I get passionate and I forgot what I was going to say.
That's what we need at this hour. We need some passion in there. And Larry, I want to bring you into this. You've gotten to hear all of this, and one of the things that we talk about strategy and assessment, but a lot of this is culture change work within organizations so that we can be bolder and try things. And you have this interesting thing where you're also thinking about what's the right work. So you have some very long-standing, super important work on critical challenges like climate change, reproductive health, issues that are really on the firing line right now. And you're doing some emergent work around democracy, cybersecurity. Can you talk about how you're working internally? You're bringing in people who disagree. What are you doing to really position Hewlett to be as effective and bold as it can be on some of the most critical issues of the day?
Yeah, it's going to be hard to fit this in with the direction the panel has taken. I mean, if you think about, so 2 preface points. One is, so Phil said he thinks the story of philanthropy needs to include the nonprofits. The story of philanthropy is the story of nonprofits. When we talk about philanthropy doing something, we're only talking about nonprofits doing stuff. We just give them money. We convene some, we do some things, but it is the story of the nonprofits. It's just shorthand. And so many of the debates and disputes sort of go as if there's these rich institutions or people at one end, and then there's the people they're not helping at the other end, as though there's nothing in between. And in fact, the question is, are we giving to the right organizations who are doing the right work in the right areas, right? So I think it's really important to recognize. So we're at the, as a large foundation, we are at, in some sense, the other end of the kind of ecosystem that we've been talking about, and it is going to be an ecosystem. You're going to have to work all along it in order to get anything done. So, to me, the way I think about this is, and rather than talk about sort of the internal work we're doing, although I'm happy to talk about that if people want, it's something a little different, which is, on the one hand, I think philanthropy, and again, that's a shorthand for the organizations that we support, has done an awful lot of good in the century since modern philanthropy was created. It's matured, it's changed, it continues to mature and change. I always actually disagree with people who sort of pretend that there has been some staid, fixed practice that is now being challenged. It has been in constant evolution since day one. It continues to be in constant evolution. We have not accomplished as much as the often hubristic claims that we sometimes make, and that's always annoying. We haven't eliminated racism or solved poverty or remade capitalism, of course. And of course, we're never going to do that because the truth is the resources that we have are minuscule compared to the scope of those problems. So it's foolish to overclaim, and it invites some of the criticism that we get for doing that. On the other hand, I think we have actually accomplished a fair amount of good given those resources and the nature of the problems we take on, certainly a lot more than these puzzlingly angry critics seem prepared to acknowledge. So if you think across the period, universities have been founded, huge amounts of research have been done that has reshaped our understanding of problems. Social services have been reinvented. You could just go on and on. Now again, we have not solved the huge society-wide problems, but there has been a fair amount of contribution. Now, the interesting thing about that, though, is all the good that we've done, whatever it is, and all the good we hope to do and try to do, and everything everybody on this stage has talked about, has depended on our ability to take for granted a couple of things that we're still taking for granted. So we have taken for granted, in fact, the existence of a viable political community that could embrace the kinds of disagreements that you all want to push out there and continue to work on. We've taken for granted the existence of a social and physical environment that enables you to sort of think about the long term and plan and move and push. And so if you ask me, what we're at actually is a point where those are, in a sense, the foundation, and all our work has always been efforts to improve it, but has been done with an assumption that it was there to be improved. So what happens when those foundations themselves are the things that are at risk? And when a lot of the work that we're doing is actually itself challenging the foundations even more and threatening to undermine it even more, which means we're going to get even less done. So when I look around the world and I say, okay, we have failing democratic institutions, right? Public faith broadly all across the political spectrum is just dropping left and right across all of those institutions, making them effectively dysfunctional, right? We have a warming climate that has begun to put some real pressures, but pressures that are going to increase by orders of magnitude over the next couple of generations. And completely, you don't have to think that climate change is going to end civilization as we know it to recognize that it's going to put intolerable pressures on all of our social, political, and cultural systems. Now, what do you think is going to happen when that happens? What's going to happen when, fires, cataclysmic storms, hurricanes, floods, when they're routine, common, not just like what we're seeing now, but all the time and everywhere? What's going to happen when sea rise becomes such that cities really do begin to submerge, when migration that dwarfs what we're looking at now is happening globally and threatens everybody's borders? What do you think is going to happen, right? And to what extent do we have any hope of dealing with that if our governments continue dysfunctional, much less continue the slide toward autocracy and that they're currently on? Whose rights do you think go first? So in some sense, whatever progress anybody is making on any of the issues you're talking about now, it's just going to disappear. So it's all a waste of time unless we get those problems under control. And yet, less than 1% of global philanthropy is focused on climate change, and way less than that is focused on shoring up democratic institutions. So those are the things that we've launched and moved into, are those fields. Not with the notion that we're going to fix that. That would go back to the first point. It's ridiculous to think that we're going to fix. But we can help, we can nudge things, and philanthropy as a whole could, but it gets almost no attention. And as I say, the ironic thing about it is all of this will just disappear. It really will disappear unless we stop the slide of democratic institutions and get the climate sufficiently under control that it does not completely demolish all of the systems that we have. So my view is I don't think funders can or should give up all the other things they do. I mean, that would be crazy as well. You don't want to backslide. You want to continue to make progress there. But every single funder, in my view, needs to find a non-trivial portion of what they do and put it into one or both of those problems. Particularly since time is running out on those, right? On climate, we go over a cliff in 15 to 20 years, and then it is literally too late. The democratic slide is a more recent effect, but there will be, and we can still sort of fix that, I think, but there will become a point when it's irreversible. And so these are things that need to be done now in order to do all of the other things everybody else is talking about. Sorry, that's a depressing note, huh?
Thanks, Larry. So, thank you all for very different perspectives. So I would like to invite all of you to thank the panel.
Thank you, Larry. I want to have coffee with you.
And I'd like to turn it over to Phil for our closing comments.
Yeah, just a few words of thanks. I'll start with the sponsors. Again, Walton Family Foundation, Margaret A. Cargill, McKnight, S.D. Bechtel, Bush, Fidelity Charitable, General Mills, Carlson Family, GHR, J.P. Morgan, Northwest Area Foundation. I want to thank and acknowledge, although they're not in the room, the hotel staff who did a great job here today. And maybe we can just say thank you on our way out to whoever we see. Thank you to, again, and tip them, yes. Thank you
Yes.
again to the staff of CEP, to everybody who's here, who worked to make this conference great. But I do want to single one person out, Grace Nicolette, for your leadership in putting together a fabulous conference. Grace, where are you? Yeah, thank you, Grace. I want to thank all the speakers. Everybody brought it. You never know whether anyone's going to mail it in. Nobody mailed it in. I want to thank the board, former CEP board members who keep supporting us in all kinds of ways, advisory board members, general CEP funders, folks who've supported Youth Truth, which if you don't know about it, youthtruthsurvey.org, you should. Obviously, you know this. Your work matters. I would encourage you as you leave to balance taking in all the critique, thinking about what applies to you, and this is what I said when I sort of welcomed folks a little late to the conference yesterday morning. I wasn't late anyway, which is balance that also with identifying what has worked and what is, and we've heard some examples, yielding progress at your own foundation, in your own life experience, in what you observe, and remembering that nonprofits supported by the giving of your foundations and many others are a vital part of the good in this country and globally. Thank you for the work you do. Thanks for being here. And thank you, Kate, for moderating.